This talk is actually a follow-up to another talk which I gave at this research seminar somewhere in December 2008. Back then I started to speak of how instead of sentences floating in a logical space, one could think of actions in a rational space. I think I have made some progress since then, and I would like to report on it today. My motivation, however, did not change a lot. I'm not going to say very much about this right now, but I'm still convinced that any attempt to talk about the relation between language and reality, which shares the basic representationalist assumptions of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, is bound to fail. So, what to put in place of the representationalist view? My suggestion is inspired by the later Wittgenstein's philosophy, and I'm aware, of course, that several theoretical approaches already available claim to use the same inspiration. So, for instance, conceptual role semantics, inferentialism, enactivism in cognitive science, and some others. My own proposal has lots in common with some of these and is at least sympathetic to others from the same realm, so to say. However, I think that by focusing on actions as being the common denominator of all the moves one can make in a language game and also in life, some conceptual unity can be achieved and some conceptual improvements could also be made. This being said, I have to apologize in advance because due to the dimensions of this project, what I'm going to show you next is just a very rough sketch. I think I will need an entire book to say everything in more detail. Some ideas are already published, and I hope you'll excuse some self-references through the slides. You can ignore them. Some are not fully developed, but I hope you will form an overall impression and tell me what you think. So I start with actions as a common denominator, and I propose this distinction between non-communicative actions and communicative actions. Non-communicative actions are regular actions, opening a door, eating an apple, making tea, etc. Some of these regular actions I call empirical actions, like watching something, listening to something, touching, poking, smelling, or more generally making direct observations on objects from your environment within a shared epistemic practice. Among these communicative actions, I would distinguish between implicit and explicit communicative actions. The implicit communicative actions seem to pass a Gricean test. So, for instance, if you remember the initial definition of the speaker's non-natural meaning in Grice's first paper, I hold the door open for someone. What intentions do I have? Well, I do it intending that the other person passes through the door. But also I'm open about this intention, so that's Grice's second condition, so I intend that the other person recognizes my intention that she passes through the door, and I also intend that she passes through the door at least in part due to her recognition of my intentions. So, of course, the door is not a sign, nothing in what I do is actually a sign, but it's some sort of implicit communicative action. It's the same with offering an object to someone and several other implicit communicative actions. And then in the case of explicit communicative actions, I have these examples, right, showing an apple to someone and saying food, tagging it as food, observing that the other person is looking at the apple and saying this is food, performing different types of speech acts by uttering sentences, generally speaking. All these are, of course, communicative actions. So I'm actually going to talk about some elements of this philosophical semantics, and just only then move backwards and look at the framework, these actions in a rational space. So what do you need to talk about? Names, predicates, sentences, reference, but some alternatives to these relations and concepts from the representationalist tradition. So one concept which I think is important for this anti-representationalist philosophical semantics is this concept of basic reference, which is not a relation. So reference, according to this concept of basic reference, is not a relation. A relation between a name or a predicate, something in your mind, and then a relation between something in your mind and something out there in the world. So I started with these examples of tagging and dispredication. I use a indexical, a demonstrative, right, this, and I say, for instance, this is a cup, right, or I just show the object and tag it as a cup. So the point of basic reference is that it's a communicative action performed. Tagging and dispredication are actions, communicative or linguistic if you wish, performed directly on objects. So I use the object directly to say something about it. Such explicit communicative actions are usually accompanied by demonstrations, but they need not be. A constitutive condition for performing both tagging and dispredication is that their addressee is performing an empirical action on the object we use for tagging or dispredication. A success condition for performing those communicative actions is that their agent and their addressee get to cooperate in acting on the same object. Demonstrations are implicit communicative actions, the explicit form of which would be look at this, or more generally engage yourself perceptually with this. Right, as such, one can demonstrate an object without referring to it, that is, without using it to perform a speech act or some explicit communicative action. You just demonstrate the object. More generally, all speech acts performed directly on an object, acted upon by the addressee and with respect to which both the speaker and the addressee can be said to cooperate, regardless of the fact that their syntactic structure includes an object handle like this, the demonstrative, for the purpose of predication or not, are a basic form of reference. So this is the idea that someone can perform communicative actions directly on objects. You don't need this sort of reference relation. And then, of course, you can talk about names used referentially as also handles for communication, are actually, according to this view, markers used for communication. So again, we can perform communicative acts directly on objects. The object is the object of my action in the same way in which a potato is the object of my action when I peel it. For some of these acts, we can use a demonstrative indexical as a linguistic instrument. However, the demonstrative indexical is a temporary handle, while the proper name used referentially is more like a permanent handle. So one could say that names are markers used for communication. Regular markers are just used for re-identification of objects. So if you think, for instance, of a ranger walking through the woods, deciding that a certain tree, he's going to cut that tree tomorrow, makes a mark on the tree, right? If it's a mark just on one tree, it's a unique marker. If a ranger makes the same mark on several trees, is more like a tag, right? More like a general term, not a singular term. So how how can one introduce a name? This is X, right? X is the name, is a paradigmatic case of marking an object for communication. By uttering the words, I perform a particular kind of speech act belonging to the class of declarations. So it's not when I introduce the name, I use the demonstrative. I can just ostensibly introduce the proper name. But in any case, what I say is neither true nor false. It's a declaration. It's a different kind of speech act. And then by uttering the words, I apply the marker for communication directly to my object, which is held in place by the demonstrative. One could use, as I was saying, an ostensive marking for communication instead. And what seems to be specific for proper names is that it's not that the same word or the same sounds couldn't have a different use, but the marking action, this introduction of the name for one object is unique. So I don't introduce the same name for another object. What about predicates? Well, I've already been talking about tags. Tags are the ancestors of predicates. They make either natural affordances of the things from our environment or the functional properties of our artifacts explicit. They might have other uses, but these are the first which come to mind. And with respect to the conceptual content of the predicates, I'm in much agreement with this inferentialist approach. So I would agree that the conceptual content of a predicate term is captured by introduction and elimination rules, in the same way in which the meaning of a logical connective can be given by its introduction and elimination rules. Only the difference, in my view, is that I'm not going to consider that in an introduction rule one needs to move from some sensory data or from a perception to a sentence, and then other inferences specific for elimination rules might be from sentences to actions. It's going to be actions all the way, right? So observing that something is an apple by the performance of some empirical action is a sufficient condition for tagging it as food, which is a sufficient condition for eating it. And all the series of actions of this sort, you have actions from the beginning to the end. All the series of actions of this sort, with the action of saying that something is food in the middle, give us the conceptual content of the predicate food. So here is something like a model. It's just a simplified model. So, for instance, you have the empirical action, observing that there is an apple on the table, and also perhaps observing that my son is looking at it. Then the explicit communicative action, this is food. And if I say the arrows are inferences, right? If I say one can move from the empirical all the time, from this kind of empirical action to this kind of explicit communicative action, that's an introduction rule for the predicate food is food. Then I can move via some other inferences, so to say, from these explicit communicative actions to other communicative actions, either explicit, right? The predicate is food disappears, but I have you can eat this, or implicit communicative actions, taking a bite of the apple to show to my son that it is edible, or I can move directly to regular non-communicative actions, using the apple to make a meal. It's still an inference from saying this is food. So all these kinds of so-called inferences are going to give the conceptual content, so to say. Now, of course, there is a problem with talking about inferential relations between actions. And what do you mean by this? Why should anyone accept that there can be inferential relations between actions? Well, my reply to this is you can drop talking about inferences if this is bothering you and think of this kind of relation. Something follows by reason from something else. B follows by reason from A. A and B are actions. B follows by reason from A if and only if either doing A is a sufficient condition for assuming a responsibility for doing B, or assuming a responsibility for doing B is a necessary condition for doing A. Either condition works, of course, they should be equivalent, but I know that there are people saying it's not always the case that A is a necessary condition, A is a sufficient condition for B, if and only if B is a necessary condition for A. There are people rejecting this equivalence, so that's why I'm just listing both cases in there. For instance, let A be the action of opening a locked door and B be the action of unlocking the door, right? So the action of unlocking the door follows by reason from the action of opening a locked door, right? If you perform the action of opening the locked door, then you assume a responsibility for unlocking the door. A could be the action of making a tea, B the action of boiling water. It's the same case. The action of boiling water follows by reason from the action of making a tea. Generally speaking, in all these practical cases, it can be said that we infer means from ends, and that's what Elizabeth Hanscom basically says when she talks about actions. Right? She talks about something being an action only if it's included. It might be an event, but when it's included in the practice of giving reasons, then it can be an action. Giving reasons means, right, why are you boiling that can of water? Because I'm making a tea. But always the reason is the premise and the means is the conclusion. The end is the premise, the means is the conclusion. It might well, I hope it's still working. Something looks on my screen a bit. No, it's okay. Okay. Everybody was frozen on my screen, but no, it's working. So this is just a case. More examples. I turn on the lights. This is an action. From this one, it follows by reason that I press the light switch. Why? Because assuming a responsibility for pressing the light switch is a necessary condition for turning on the lights. Or the other way around, turning on the lights is a sufficient condition for assuming a responsibility for pressing the light switch. And these are not two different events necessarily. They might be right actions under different descriptions. So you might recall Hanscom talks about a series of action. There is a man moving his arm, and by moving his arm he's actually using a water pump to replenish the water supply from a building and actually to poison the people living in that building. So, but it could be said, yeah, it's one and the same event, but there are 4 actions because you can talk about that event under different descriptions, and that's the series. But it's still the same. What features as an end in the series is going to be a premise, and a means is going to be the conclusion. Right? Why do you press the light switch? Well, to turn on the lights. Then pressing the light switch follows by reason from the action of turning on the lights. Next example. I order you to bring me a glass. Now this is with speech acts, but they are still communicative actions. So I order you to bring me a glass of water. From this it follows by reason that I ask you to bring me a glass of water. According to, well, it follows logically according to Searle and van der Weken, but it's still a good example for this relation of something following by reason from something else. I opine that Socrates was a philosopher. From this communicative action, it follows by reason that I opine that Socrates was human, because by performing the first action, opining that Socrates was a philosopher, I do something which is sufficient for assuming a responsibility for opining that Socrates was human. And this example is probably fitting what... Not probably. It's fitting what Brandon says about discursive commitment, but instead of commitment, I prefer to talk about responsibility and assuming a responsibility. I'll say something more about this in a minute. I look at a chair, I say this is a chair, performing the action of looking at a chair under this description, because all actions are performed under some descriptions. They are not simply natural events, right? And I can only give reasons for an action if I accept the descriptions. That also comes from Anscombe. So I say this is a chair. Saying that something is a chair, right, is also an action, and then it follows by reason from this one. This is something one can sit in. I utter this chair is now yours. I give you the chair. The second one is the implicit communicative action. Uttering this chair is now yours is a sufficient condition for assuming a responsibility for giving the chair to you. The second is a necessary condition for the successful performance of the former. All these examples are supposed to illustrate the same relation, this relation of something following by reason from something else, with the relata being actions. Now, what does it mean to assume a responsibility for an action? Brandon talks about commitment and entitlement, so something being a sufficient condition for assuming a responsibility for an action is called entitlement, something being a necessary condition, assuming a responsibility for something. Well, it's a bit different there, because by doing something you assume a responsibility. That's a necessary condition for assuming a responsibility for doing something else, and that's commitment. But I think these concepts of entitlement and commitment are not as clear as this idea of assuming a responsibility for an action. Because one can make it a bit more clear by saying it's not duty responsibility. This distinction comes from literature, but I was in a hurry, so I don't have a reference for it, but I've encountered it in some literature. sorry. Duty, responsibility, ownership, responsibility, right? If I have a duty, responsibility, sometimes people talk about prospective responsibility, then, right, I broke your window, I have a duty responsibility to pay you for the damage. Ownership responsibility, if the action was mine, that's ownership responsibility. When asked who did that, I'm supposed to raise my hand. I have ownership responsibility. But when I'm talking here about assuming a responsibility, that's not a duty responsibility, because then you'll have cases of this sort. Promising to do A is sufficient for having a duty responsibility for doing A. But the action does not follow by reason from the actual action, right? Doing A does not follow by reason from a promise. It does not follow by reason from making a promise the performance of the action. One might say what follows by reason from promising to do A is attributing to yourself the intention to do A, but not the actual performance of the action. Right? Because there is no guarantee that you will perform the action. So, not duty responsibility, not ownership responsibility either, because one cannot be said to have performed the action, to have ownership responsibility for the action of opining that Socrates was human by simply having opined that Socrates was a philosopher. Right? The person is going to say, what I said was only that he was a philosopher. It's not my action. It's not true that I already said or opined that he was human. Right, but it's as if you did. So, a responsibility for A could be, I accept blame for A or praise for A as if I did. I'm not going to say I did A, but it's as if I did. Because suppose in this example of using predictive text for writing, right? What follows by reason from writing an entire sentence is that you wrote every letter from that sentence. And it might be the case with predictive text writing that you don't write every single letter, right? You're shown some options and you choose entire words or phrases, and that's how you write that sentence. But if from writing the entire sentence follows by reason that it's as if, right, you're responsible for having written each letter, then you're not going to say, oh, yeah, it's a spelling mistake in here, it's not my fault. You're going to accept the blame, but also the praise for spelling an uncommon word correctly, even if you used predictive text. So it's as if you also did A, or as if, in the case of a responsibility for A, when you don't necessarily need of agents, is as if the second action, following by reason from the first, was also performed. Of course, there are other problems with this relation of following by reason. One imaginable objection is, yeah, but Socrates was a philosopher, therefore Socrates was human, this is not a valid inference. And the reply is, yes, it's not a valid formal inference, it's a material inference in Seller's sense, skipping some boring details, all philosophers are humans. The second premise can be viewed as the semantic rule of that inference. And in the same manner, one could say that the belief that one can make tea only if one boils water is not a premise in some practical argument, but a rule of the practical reasoning employed when making tea. So it's not going, we don't need that in premises, among the premises anymore, if we talk about material inferences of this sort. And of course, the following by reason relation could also be regarded as the ancestor of the formal inference relation. And now we are at this level of actions in a rational space. If one can talk about such relations, some primitive inferences between actions, then one should be able to place actions in some sort of rational space. Here, I have thought of different things. I don't know yet what to say. I have some ideas, but I don't want to say anything about disjunctive actions. In the case of conjunctive actions, things are simple, right? One performs A by performing B and C, and then A is a conjunctive action. In the case of negative actions, my view is there is no such thing. There are no negative actions, but you can have opposing relations between actions, and this relation of opposition between actions can also be regarded as an ancestor of the relation of logical contradiction. And it goes something like this. So you could say that an action X is opposed to an action given a series of actions with some purpose if a K belongs to the series, and if X were part of the series, then X would make it unattainable for the agent or agents of the rest of the actions from the series to achieve the purpose of the series. Then you have normal opposition when you have such an opposition for most of the series to which the second action belongs. This is still not a symmetrical relation. Then you have symmetrical normal opposition. Then you have normal contradiction when A and B are communicative actions. And then at the fifth definition, you have in this construction, right, starting with this weak opposition relation, you have the relation of logical contradiction. What about rules? Because right here, if you are choosing to talk about material inferences, some of the premises in some formal inferences are not going to figure in a material inference, are going to become rules, semantic rules or rules of practical reasoning. But how are they going to work? And because of all this discussion about Wittgenstein's rule following consideration, I'm going to start with the idea that rules are embedded into our practices, are not any kind of entities, but are simply embedded into our practices. Right, but how? And here, for instance, you know, this logical equivalence, right? And then you can think of a conditional rule as being embedded into a practice like this. The rule says do A only if you assume a responsibility for doing B, and I incorporate the rule, I enact the rule, I put it into my practice by performing actions which are opposed to the performance of A without the assumption of responsibility for the performance of B, or sometimes without the performance of B. So given the conditional rule, one eats only after washing his or her hands. If you try to eat without washing your hands, the other members of the community observing the same rule will perform actions which are opposed to your attempt. Right? And this is how the conditional rule is embedded into a practice. If you try to opine that Socrates was a philosopher but refused to accept that he was human, the other members of the linguistic community will treat your speech acts as unsuccessful. And this is also something opposed to, right, doing A and not B, so to say. And what about actions again? Of course, there are several philosophical problems, right? And choices to be made. But I think there are not so many philosophical problems as those generated by the representationalist view in semantics. So this is just a list of my choices within this field, theory of actions. I think I have my actions as events which I'm responsible for under a certain description. Basic actions are the simplest actions for which I can attribute a responsibility to myself. The attribution of responsibility is related to some established practices, asking for reasons, praising, blaming someone for doing it, usually when the event was under the control of that person, and that's what is more important for the causalists in theory, in action theory. I'm closer to Anscombe in this respect. All actions introduce the roles of agent and recipient or addressee. Some include the use of tools. In most cases, one can talk about an object acted upon. We talk about such objects in technological terms. So we usually conceive what we act upon as raw materials, artifacts, waste. We don't describe the objects acted upon usually in a naturalist vocabulary. What if someone is unable to perform explicit communicative actions, right? Because all this Anscombian view and also what you've seen, most of what you've seen up to this point, right? Someone who cannot give reasons for acting, right? That's why who cannot recognize an action under a certain description is not a proper agent. So what about small children or animals? Can they be agents? Can they have some conceptual contents? I would say yes. So can we still say that X is doing A where A is an action and X is an agent if X is unable to perform explicit communicative actions? Yes, I mean, I have one example which is very close to me. My youngest son, which is autistic and he doesn't speak, right? No explicit communicative actions, but there are lots of possible interactions, lots of, if you don't like this phrase, something follows by reason from something else, lots of algorithms, lots of such embedded rules, practical embedded rules, which he can learn. So I think one can talk about primitive actions, primitive conceptual content, even in such cases. And also, it's important to do this not because I like to think that my autistic son has concepts, but because you need the evolutionary story to work, right? You need to see a gradual progression from living beings not having any sort of conceptual content to humans having full-blown concepts. And this case of these situations in which you have some primitive actions, agents, and primitive conceptual contents, even if you don't have language and explicit communicative actions, I think these are useful. And the main philosophical problem which my proposal might generate is to do away with the apparent gap between an intentional vocabulary used to talk about persons, actions, beliefs, rules, reasons, justification, logical reasons, etc., and the naturalist vocabulary used to talk about natural entities, phenomena, laws, causal relations, and so on. And I think the gap can be done away with. What I would be careful about is not to eliminate this intentional vocabulary. So, for instance, I tend to favor an eliminativist approach with respect to a psychological vocabulary, but not with respect to this intentional vocabulary. I don't think one cannot naturalize all the story of concept, of language acquisition, concept formation, and everything, but I don't think that should be a good enough reason to eliminate this intentional vocabulary as an intuition, a philosophical intuition, if you wish. Yeah. Thank you. That was all I wanted to share to you today.